Did you know that ambush predators tend to have vertical slit pupils to better pinpoint their prey, while grazers tend to have horizontal pupils to better scan the horizon for incoming movement? We created this tree of life that focuses on the evolution of animal eyes, and we're going to walk through it with Professor Lars Schmitz.
I'm Lars Schmitz. I study vision and the evolution of eyes, and I just love everything about eyes.
We'll start at the base of the tree with an early branching fork of animals called cnidaria.
The box jellyfish actually have 24 different eyes in clusters of 6 eyes each. One pair of these eyes in each of these clusters are not unlike our own eyes. They are camera-type eyes. Our human eye works similar to a camera. We have the aperture, the pupil, that lets the light in, behind which we have the optical system. So what we nicely see here is the curved cornea, the optical apparatus in front of the eye, and the second optical element, the lens. It's a bit flatter. Those together refract light onto the retina and forms an image. To stay with a camera analog, this would be where the film would be, or the receptors. Cubozoans are really interesting in that they don't have a centralized nervous system. They have a nerve net, which allows them to process visual stimuli, but they don't have a real brain. So it's actually really puzzling how they can actually interpret those visual signals.
From here, the tree of life has a major divergent path. We'll follow first the side of the protostomes, which includes insects and many deep-sea animals.
Scallops. They actually have dozens of eyes around their mantle. Every single blue dot you see in this image, these little blueberries, those are eye structures. This ring of blueberry eyes is actually useful for them as a defensive mechanism and a little bit of a navigation help. The way these scallops form images in their little blueberry eyes is very different from what we do. It has a mirror that's sitting behind the retina, and that mirror is used to focus the light back onto the retina. So a really complicated mechanism, but it works well enough to get you an image of the scenery. The resolution is really not that good, but scallops can actively move, so they can visual navigate to an extent. And also when they see something approaching, they can shut down and close down and protect themselves.
Let's look at a few examples of eyes from some cephalopods.
The pinhole eye of the nautilus works just like the pinhole camera and has a very small opening through which light enters, and then an inverted image is formed on the retina. So let's take a look at the human eye model here. We take out all the optics, essentially. Light's coming in from right here, and then the image, as crude as it is, falls directly onto the retina. The smaller the pupil, the better the resolution of the resulting image. But the issue there is, if you make the pupil really small, the image will be dimmer and dimmer the smaller the pupil is. They do have a central nervous system to process visual information. Actually a little bit of a mystery what exactly they're using that eye for. The resolution isn't super good. The image will be a little bit dim, so it's kind of limited on what it can see with that eye. Octopus have chambered eye type, and in difference to the nautilus, this one has a lens. And what we have in common here is this deep eye cup. A pupil that's really well defined. That's the only part where light can enter the eye and nowhere else. If light from all directions could enter the eye, we wouldn't know where it's coming from. One really important difference between octopus and our own eye. We have a retina that is inverted. The photoreceptors are actually pointing away from the light. And the axons that transmit the signal approach the incoming light. But in octopus, the retina is the other direction, with the photoreceptors pointing towards the incoming light and the axons going away. A side effect of the inverted retina that we have, the so-called blind spot in the retina where we do not have any photoreceptors. So in this model, we can see the optic nerve really clearly right here. So this is where all the axons from the photoreceptors are bundled together and exit the eye and transmit the signal off to the brain. But in this part right here where the axons exit, that's where we cannot have any photoreceptors. So that's our blind spot. From my understanding, it's not really well known how exactly and what may explain that pattern. There may be a small advantage of having the photoreceptors a little bit further back. The resolution of the image may be a tiny little bit better. Personally, I'm not sure if that's a huge reason that would provide additional evolutionary fitness. The bottom line is, our retina, even though it's inverted, it works well enough. One thing that's really interesting about squid is their cool pupil shapes. If we just look at squid, here are two examples. On your right, you see this U shape. On the left, we have this W shape in here. So quite a bit of variety. The function of these pupil shapes is a little bit of a mystery. And a really interesting hypothesis in this context is color vision. Color vision in squid is not well supported behaviorally, but it would make sense given that they use colors for signaling, for example. In humans, in our own color vision, we use 3 different opsin types, so 3 different photopigments to distinguish different colors. So we have red, green, and blue. Depending on the strength of the relative excitation of these pigments, we can infer what color wavelength we're actually looking at. In squid, we don't have different opsin types. We have one opsin. The image would be essentially a grayscale image. How can they see color if they only have one opsin type? Many animals correct an optical problem, chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration results from the fact that shorter wavelength light is refracted more strongly than longer wavelength light. If you have blue light versus red light, the blue light would be focused a little bit before the retina and the red light a little bit behind the retina. So you get a little bit of an offset. Now, this is something that most animals actually try to get rid of. There's the hypothesis that these pupils actually accentuate the chromatic aberration. They make it worse. And they can use that to tell what color light they're actually looking at. This blur hypothesis is a bit controversial in our community. Some people say, while theoretical, possibly the practical benefit isn't all that big. The key will be to test how these animals perceive colors and if there's good behavioral evidence to find out.
As we head back through the tree of life, let's stop to talk about the flatworm.
This little fellow has 2 very conspicuous eyes right here. These are very simple eyes, like little ice spots. What we see here is eyes that are really not good from our perspective, but are beneficial to this aquatic flatworm. Essentially, it would help them to avoid getting eaten. These eyes are consisting of just 2 cell types. They have photoreceptors in a shallow cup. That cup is shielded by pigmented cells. So light can only reach these eye cups from above and a little bit from the side, but it cannot reach the eye cup from below because that's where the pigmented cells are. This flatworm would be able to tell if it's in bright versus dark environments. And it would know if the light is coming from directly above or perhaps a little bit from the side. Now that seems like utterly useless to us, but for this flatworm, it's good to know, like, it's bright, it's exposed, it's in the dark, it's perhaps a bit protected.
Now let's cover the other fork of the protostomes, which include insects, spiders, and some other arthropods.
Most spiders have 8 eyes. In the jumping spider, the 2 front-facing eyes are clearly enlarged. That tells us that that pair of eyes is most important for that particular spider. They're actively hunting during the day, and it would make sense for them to have like forward-facing eyes that have high acuity so they can see their prey better. They have eyes that more or less look like a camera type eye that we have seen before. One lens, one aperture in here, we see this quite nicely, is a different principle, different structural principle than pretty much all the other arthropods. A little bit of a mystery how they evolved. It may have been derived from a compound eye, but how exactly we don't know yet. Having 4 pairs of eyes that are surrounding your head gives you essentially perfect parameter vision. Splitting the jaw up into different parts, the accessory pairs could be used to scan the environment for any possible movement, whereas the forward-facing eyes in this case have really good acuity and give you lots of detailed information. Mantis shrimp. One of the most bizarre animals. They're really cool. They can throw really hard punches and they're super fast. These compound eyes are situated in stalks that kind of reach up a little bit. They truly have panoramic vision, 360 degrees, no problem whatsoever. Mantis shrimp are also known to have not just 3 opsins that we have, but they actually have 12 opsins. For many years, it was thought that mantis shrimp had superb color vision. It turns out that color vision of mantis shrimp isn't actually all that good. they process that information very differently from us. Our opsins have very broad range over which they actually respond to light. So we have 3 of these different peaks, and they all overlap, and they're excited to different degrees from different wavelengths light. In mantis shrimp, having 12 opsins, each of them probably captures a smaller range of wavelengths. So they have more like discrete channels instead of like largely overlapping absorption ranges. So that's probably explaining why they actually don't have superb color vision. Still good, but could be better.
Now let's look at some examples of arthropod eyes.
Maybe let's start with the fly eye right in here. This style of eye is called a compound eye because it consists of many different individual lenses. The resulting image as a whole is a mosaic of all the different images put together. Probably don't think of our eyes as simple, quote unquote, but compared to these compound eyes, they actually are pretty simple because we have one lens and these have thousands of lenses. We have this really like these bulging eyes. So they're spherical, but they're coming towards us. So they're kind of inside out from our own eyes. The part of the eye that's here will not receive light that's coming from behind. The part of the eye that's here will get light from the side, a little bit from the front, but not from the left side. It gives you a really good idea where light's coming from. Flies cannot move their eye structures around because these are all little crystalline lenses. No eye movements in here or lens shape changes. This is what you got. Depending on the position of the eyes and the orientation on the head, many insects, including these flies, can essentially have full panoramic vision all the way around, 360-degree vision. So the elephant hawk moth has eyes that are very light sensitive and it can see colors at night, which is really hard to do. We only see this in these hawk moths and also in geckos. It's a different type of compound eye. We call this the superposition eye. In the apposition eye, what we talked about before, we had each ommatidium producing an average image, and those images were put together in the mosaic. Here, what we see in this compound eye, there's a separation between the lenses and the retina where the image is received. So we have a projection of an image onto the retina. So we're having a single image that's being formed instead of a mosaic. It allows for much brighter images to be formed. So this eye type is often found in insects that are active at night. Many of the superposition eyes have a little layer that's reflective. It's called the tapetum. The tapetum lucidum, to be specific. You may have seen this when you're driving at night and you see a deer in a headlight, the eyes are like popping up really bright, this eye shine. So imagine you have light arriving at the retina. Many of the photons are being absorbed by the photoreceptors, but not all. Those that travel through get to the tapetum, which is reflective. They're bouncing back and going through the photoreceptors again for a second chance to be absorbed. We see this tapetum evolving several times independently in all groups that are nocturnally active. One thing we can see in this dragonfly eye, the lenses here are relatively small. So the smaller the ommatidia in this case, in this particular eye type, the better the acuity or the better the resolution of that image. Now, one thing that we see often is that the ommatidia change their shape depending on where you are, horizontal or on top or more towards the bottom. So they have zones of high acuity that tells us something about how they live and what they're going after, what they're trying to monitor. One thing that is a limitation to compound eyes is this design structure. If these animals want to make a really high acuity eye, we need very long focal length. And with this kind of setup, that's not gonna work. They would need to have eyes that are 100 times bigger than what they can really fit on their head. And I mean, their visual ability is pretty good. I mean, they're tiny animals, but they can still see quite a bit. Good enough so we cannot catch them often. It tells us that their visual processing must be reasonably fast. So this is quite an incredible task, actually, and they do it well.
Let's go back to the trilobite for a moment. Existing in the Cambrian era, trilobites provide some of the oldest eyes in the fossil record.
So here is the pair of eyes that this trilobite has. You can imagine it's really hard to find squishy eyes in the fossil record, right? These compound eyes with their crystalline lenses have a bit of an advantage to become fossils, and this is really important for us to study vision in deep time. For example, we can look at the size and the shape of the lenses, and that tells us a bit about how the acuity and sensitivity must have been like. In this particular type of trilobite, which is a phacops, the lenses are quite large. And this is a really interesting cue for us to study the behavior and ecology of these fossils, which is otherwise really hard to do with just the fossil record. Their large size would suggest to us that this animal was probably able to see in very dim conditions. So it was either in deeper water or primarily active at night.
We'll now double back and explore the other side of the tree, the deuterostomes. And we'll start here with our underwater friends, the echinoderms.
Sea stars have light-sensitive cells at the top of their arms. It's not really image forming, it's really low resolution vision, but it's good enough for them to tell shade from bright parts of the seafloor. So they can use this to stay hidden for protection from predators. Again, adding to the fact that even like very rudimentary visual structures are useful for the organism. That way, natural selection easily explains the evolution of sophisticated eyes. Nielsen and Pelger determined in the 90s with a very conservative computational model that it would take only about 1 million years, 256,000 generations, to evolve from patch of light-sensitive cells to a complex image-forming eye. And if you think about like how much time was available to these organisms to evolve eyes, that's just like nothing, like literally like a blink. Similar to the sea star, sea urchin have light-sensitive cells that are distributed across their little feet. And this is another example of diffuse visual system that kind of gives you information about the presence or absence of light. Not well studied how widespread photosensitive cells are across echinoderms. None of them are known, at least to the best of my knowledge, to have full image-forming eyes, but photosensitivity is probably more widespread than we know so far. Not many people are looking at sea urchins and their visual structures. People should, though.
We move on now to chordates, which are all vertebrates, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. First up are the fish.
You're looking at the four-eyed fish. Actually, it doesn't have 4 eyes, but it has 4 pupils. One set of pupils that see through air, and the other set of pupils, they see through water. Upper pupil, lower pupil. And the reason for that is that once the eyes pop out of water, the cornea of these eyes becomes functional and helps with the refraction and bending of light. So it helps with the formation of images. Underwater, the cornea does not work at all. And the lens is the only optical element that fish have at their disposal to form an image. When seeing through air, the lens can be flatter, meaning it's not as strong because you have the cornea too. In the four-eyed fish, anableps has it both. So the lens is completely irregularly shaped, functionally spherical for underwater vision, but flattened functionally for seeing through air. Vision through water and vision through air is also different from another perspective. We take one step back and think about like how much light is actually available and how far you can see underwater versus seeing through air. It's a huge difference. Vision is metabolically actually pretty expensive. Similar to brain tissue, it has to be maintained, it's very costly. From an evolutionary perspective, big eyes are expensive. We looked at exactly this step in the history of vertebrates where tetrapods came on land. We had the evolution of vision from seeing through water to seeing through air. And that transition was coupled with a significant increase of eye size at that time. Having big eyes really only pays off, evolutionarily speaking, if you can see a long distance. In blennies, a group of really colorful and diverse reef fishes, we have independent eye movements. One eye is stationary, the other one is moving around. And one thing that's interesting about this pupil shape is that if you look really closely, we can see that there's a little gap in this teardrop shape. What we see here is an example for a different way to focus the image. In humans and many other vertebrates that live on land, the lens shape is actually changed when we focus on different objects in the visual field. Now, fish don't do that. Fish have a spherical lens that is actually really hard, almost like a marble, and it cannot change its shape. What these fish do is move the lens around to focus on different parts in the visual scene. If this little blenny wants to focus on something that's directly in front of it, what it will do is it will move the lens from here into this little gap up there and then focus on it. That's called the lensless space or the aphakic gap. And this is something I've studied in quite a bit of detail, looking across like many different reef fishes and understanding how eye shapes and sizes change with the ecology and lifestyle of these animals. So if you look, for example, at this soldier fish in here, we see that we have a very large eye and a very large and rounded pupil. And that helps to collect more light. This is a nice contrast to the blenny, which is diurnal, where we have this pointed pupil shape and the eye is actually quite a bit smaller. This other soldier fish here, there's hardly any lensless space. It's like fully expanded. While we can constrict and dilate the pupil, these fish can't. If it's bright or dark, that pupil shape will always be the same. Not ideal, because if they're exposed to very rapidly changing light levels, they're kind of screwed. Maybe completely overexposed to light, actually not see that much during that time. Now, fish have an interesting mechanism to deal with changing light levels. If we stay with a camera analog, they can switch out the film and change it for a different light sensitivity. Vertebrates have rod and cone photoreceptors. Rods are really light sensitive, but don't give you any color vision. The cones are less light sensitive and they provide color vision. When fish approaching dusk, there is migration of the photoreceptors within the retina. So what they're doing is they're switching out the cones for rods. The cones are withdrawn and shielded by pigment, and the rods come out and become functional. The problem with that mechanism, even though it seems brilliant, it's not fast. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes, which is the time for predators to strike. This is a very hectic and chaotic time on the reef.
We'll explore now the amphibian branch, where animals need the ability to see both above and below water.
Frogs are known to have charismatically big eyes, and what's really cool is that they have a ton of variety in terms of their pupil shapes. So starting with the vertical slit pupil in here, where we have the pupil extending sort of from the bottom towards the top, and we can contrast that perhaps with a horizontally aligned pupil that we have here. Our simple circular pupil that we have here, so many aquatic frogs tend to have that. But this is much different, for example, from this inverted triangle shape in here, where we have like this pointed tip pointing downwards. We also have fan shapes that can be inverted or regular, so variations to the same theme. We also have pupil shapes that are shaped like this diamond here, where we have like 6 major corners, which is really unique. The diversity is just stunning. What are these different pupil shapes good for? With this particular study, they didn't really find a strong ecological signal in that data. None of these pupil shapes was really tightly connected to a particular type of ecology, except for those of aquatic frogs, which is perhaps the, hate to say it, most boring pupil shape is just circular, like ours. In a way, not finding a clear ecological signal makes it really hard to find a clear function for these different pupil shapes. Traditionally, we have vertical slit pupils associated with predators and horizontal pupils in prey species. This model, we would assign this pupil shape to a predator and this pupil shape rather to a prey species. In frogs, this is not supported by the data. So evolution is never selecting for the optimal or the single best structure. There's many different ways to do something. They all get the job done. It works well enough, and hence we see this diversity. So geckos are really light sensitive. They're primarily nocturnal. You probably say, well, they probably have really good rods, cones for day vision, rods for night vision. But geckos do everything with just cones. They have evolved from lizards that have lost their rods during their evolutionary history. Their ancestors were largely diurnal and day active, and they secondarily returned to life at night. Geckos have modified their cone photoreceptors to be able to work in the dark. So they do all that night vision with the machinery that had evolved originally for day vision. We know that gecko eyes are very, very, very light sensitive. They have to make sure that they are not overexposing their retina to too much light. So they really have to constrict their pupils a lot to avoid that problem. What we see here is that we have a series of 4 little pinholes that are being formed in here. They minimize the amount of light that gets into the eye, but that gives you a really large depth of focus, so it will be really hard to get any distance estimation. One hypothesis is related to Shiner's discs, which is used by ophthalmologists. Essentially, for Shiner's disc, you use 2 tiny little pupils, and then you determine if that's resolved or if it's not resolved, and then you know if there's any vision deficiencies. Adding the string of 4 pupils on top of each other, a decreased depth of focus, you introduce some blur, and that blur is useful to judge distances. So snakes are a bit odd. They can see heat. For example, pit vipers. The name pit comes from a pit that would sit pretty much right here in front of the eye, lined with thermoreceptors. And the information that's coming from that pit goes to the same brain region where the visual information goes. And that's actually combined with visual information. They're a bit odd among the vertebrates. For example, they don't have any bone structures within their eyes that many other reptiles do. They don't have the so-called scleral ring. The shape of the snake eye, traditionally there have been 2 hypotheses. One says that the shape of snake eyes evolved because snakes went through a phase in their evolution. They were mostly burrowing underground, which came with a lot of modifications to their eyes, which they didn't really use. Alternate hypothesis was that snakes were aquatic early on in the history, and that could explain many of their somewhat odd structures and similarities with other organisms in this. Chameleons can move their eyes independently. They can fixate on one object while moving the other eye and scanning its environment for potential predators. So for all the animals that we have talked about so far that have a lens, those are converging lenses where the image is focused on one part. Now in chameleons, we do find a negatively powered lens, meaning it's actually diverging. It's enlarging, it's magnifying the image on the retina, but it's looking at a very small part of the visual scene surrounding it. Essentially, it's using its eye as somewhat more like a telescope. It also comes with like a depth of focus, and by focusing through that visual field, like close and further away, it can judge distance. They need that visual acuity and the distance perception to actually successfully capture their prey with a tongue flick.
As we make our way through the chordates, we are now looking at reptiles, which include squamates, archosaurs, and also, surprisingly, birds.
Among alligators and crocodiles, we find really pronounced vertical slit pupils. Really good examples for ambush predators. One idea is vertical slit pupils enhance the way predators can see prey species standing on the ground, and they really pop out nicely from everything else that's kind of more towards the horizon. That's a little bit blurred. Highlights vertical contours. It kind of blurs horizontal contours. Objects that are closer may be in focus, objects that are further away are not in focus, and that is useful to gauge the distance. So one other really interesting thing about alligator and crocodile eyes is their position as well. They live at the water-air interface. Their eyes are just poking through the water surface, and they kind of scan everything that's surrounding them to find possible prey items. And that is enabled by having the eyes in a kind of upward-facing position above the water. Birds, okay, our living dinosaurs. Let's start with the owl, perhaps. Amazing birds, forward-facing eyes. They have really good night vision, but they also have really quite good acuity. So they actually have eyes that kind of do it all. Owls have really found a way to maximize the size of their eyes for their given head. And that gives them a somewhat odd eye shape, which is called tubular. And normally an eyeball is shaped kind of elliptical. And in owls, the sides are kind of cut off. It's more like tubular. For a wide eyeball, there was just not enough space. The eyes are so big that the eyes cannot move within the eye sockets. They have scleral rings that support the eye structures. The eyes are wider inside the eye socket than the eye socket diameter is. They're filling out all that space. You see that kind of eye shape also in deep sea fish. Totally different group, independently evolved for likely similar reasons. Trying to make the eyes as big as possible for the space they've got. They can't move the eyes within the eye sockets, but owls can move their head exceptionally well, almost doing a full turn, and that gives them that peripheral vision that they would need to detect something behind them. We often think of ourselves as having the best eyes, but that's actually not true. Whatever we do, the eagle does it about twice as good. So they can see things that are half the size from the same distance. And they do it with eyes that are actually somewhat smaller than our own eyes. That's remarkable. In their zone of most acute vision in their retina, they're packing the photoreceptors as densely as possible. And you can somewhat compare that to the number of pixels you have on a display, for example. The more of these pixels you pack in there, the better the resolution. And that's what these eagles have pushed to an extreme. There's a physical limit to how small a photoreceptor can be. It cannot be narrower than the wavelength of light. These eagles push at the physical limits of visual acuity.
And now, towards the extent of the deuterostome branch of the tree, we find the mammals.
Horses have among the largest eyes that we find on land, 5 to perhaps 6 centimeters in diameter. It's a pretty sizable eyeball. And horses have their eyes placed laterally, pointing to left and right. So you get much more of a peripheral vision surrounding you, enabling you to see things and movement all the way around your head and behind your head a little bit too. Good for screening the horizon in open grassland habitats. And they also have a very pronounced horizontal slit pupil that may enhance the ability to see and scan objects moving along that horizon. Other horizontal pupils would be found, for example, in this goat. It's almost like a little angular in here, like a horizontal stripe. So we also see this horizontal pupil in this alpaca, a blue iris, and there's the horizontal pupil in here. So very similar structure if you compare the alpaca and the goat. In zebras, in here, with the iris, and again, a very pronounced horizontal slit pupil. So vertical slit pupils would allow predators to detect vertical contours rising up from the ground. With a horizontal slit pupil, the story is different. This would give them the ability to detect movement surrounding them, especially in combination with the laterally facing eyeballs that are pointing to the sides and not forward. This is considered to be an adaptation to those kind of environments. Bears as omnivores, they have nicely forward-facing eyes in here, nicely contrast the laterally facing eyes of the grazing species. We also see forward-facing eyes in dogs. Dogs' vision, well, it's not super good. No color vision. Acuity is okay. I mean, they're largely driven through their nose. Their olfactory system is phenomenal, so they rely mostly on that, but the vision is good enough. Cats also have really strongly forward-facing eyes. Here we see again a nice vertical slit pupil. It's a predator that should give them pretty much stereoscopic depth perception. Also have a large cat in here where we see a rounded pupil. So we see some differences among the cats. So it's maybe interesting that may have to do something with the absolute size of the animal, the body size. Maybe the vertical slit pupil is really effective at lower heights and perhaps not as important at larger body sizes. Probably worth investigating a little more, actually. So whales are mammals that have returned to life in the ocean. What we see in whales is several features that make it possible for them to see fairly well through water. The lens returns to a very spherical, rounded shape because the cornea is no longer any good underwater. And we also see difference in terms of what wavelength of light, what color they can see, because light is very limited, especially at the depth where these whales are actively foraging. Also, we've seen the eyes are facing pretty much laterally. They can't see much forward at all. For many whales, vision is important, perhaps not the primary sense that they're using. It depends a little bit on what they do with their diet. I mean, you have filter feeding whales. We have toothed whales that are predatory. But still, in water, whales reach the largest eye size of vertebrates that live today. So they get to about 12 centimeters approximately in diameter, which is about 3 times the size of a horse eye that we see as the largest vertebrate eye on land. Giant squid get twice the size of eye diameters. And the largest vertebrate eye that ever was around on Earth was that of ichthyosaurs, about the same size as a giant squid, about 30 centimeters or good soccer ball size, really.
And the last branch we'll look at of the tree is the primates, of which we are a part.
So tarsiers are really cool. Tarsiers are nocturnal, and their eyes are clearly adapted to being able to see in the dark, which is very different from our eyes. We are day active. Our night vision really kind of sucks. But I think the eyes of tarsiers are actually bigger in volume than their brains. So really, really big eyes, proportionally speaking. We see a tarsier here in bright daylight. So its pupils are all the way constricted, leaving like this tiny little opening right there. But in the dark, these pupils would pretty much cover all of the visible surface of the eye. The tarsier eye is functionally pretty similar to that of an owl eye, meaning it has really good ability to collect photons. What's different about the tarsier is that it doesn't have that tubular eye shape that we see in owls. So it does have enough space to fit its eyeballs, but functionally, they're pretty similar. So moving closer to humans, the macaque, an old world monkey, can't deny the similarity. Primates are kind of the odd one out among the mammals in that they are primarily active during the day hours. And so their eyes are more equipped to work in bright light conditions. You see a circular pupil, see the iris color in here, and pretty much forward-facing eyes that gives them a stereopsis and really good 3D vision ability. Again, chimpanzees, similar to us, are day active. Again, forward-facing. We have a red iris in here. In dark, we see the pupil. So these are actually very similar to our own eyes. Full circle, all the way back to humans. The pupil, right here in the dark area. This is the iris, the sclera that kind of holds it all together. The cornea would be like sitting right on top. We have eyelids in here that help clean our cornea to make sure there is no dust on there and dust particles and so forth. Well equipped for day vision, not good at night. Pretty good at color vision, pretty good acuity, not the best. The eagle has us beat, but yeah, that's our own eye. One thing that would be really worth investigating and what people are doing is trying to find structures of eyes that could help develop new technologies. If eyes work well in extreme environments, be it in dark environments, being really good at color vision, there's something we can learn from nature. Our color vision is pretty good. I mean, we can distinguish lots of different hues, but many birds and also lizards go into the UV range, something we cannot pick up at all. It would be really fascinating to find out, like, what is it like to see all that? A whole world not visible to us, and I think that would be really, really cool to look at as well.